All right. Welcome back. Part three of journalism. You've obviously clicked on the first two videos and you've heard everything from sort of like different categories of news and what makes something newsworthy, to part two, talking in primary terms about, obviously some of the dysfunction of the news industry, why, for example, we don't trust news organizations. We talked a lot about bias. We talked some key terms in that one. Well, now let's back out a little bit and talk a little more history here. It involves newspapers. And again, there's going to be some brief talk about magazines here, although very, very brief, because it's not the primary focus of our attention, but they do have somewhat of a parallel universe with newspapers. So, newspapers. And, if you were in class with me, I would say, hey, how many of you have actually picked up a physical copy of a newspaper? And my guess is that it would be very few of you, if not any of you, because nobody is picking up actual printed copies of newspapers anymore. They're kind of like a T-Rex. They're extinct, right? Now, again, going back to what I said to you in part one in the video of journalism. Journalism not dead. It's just that we've all gone to the digital format. So newspapers and magazines today, what is kind of the sort of the modern vibe, if you will, of what's happening out there? Where first of all, both newspapers and magazines, many have many roles in contemporary culture. Obviously, they chronicle, again, if we're seeing a lot of these things now online, they chronicle daily life. They do a lot of the same things, for example, that broadcast and multimedia do as well. There's obviously specialized reports. There are cultural reviews. So anytime we want to go see, for example, a movie, or we're interested in a book, whatnot, a lot of times we'll punch in, hey, tell me a review on the latest show or the latest. There's a long history of entertainment and our entertainment choices based on and maybe our art and whatnot based on what is written in a newspaper. Investigative journalism, also a very big part of the newspaper industry, long time investigative. In fact, when we talked about investigative journalism in part one, we talked about the fact that was initially one of the big cases was from the Washington Post, a paper with the pair, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, in the Watergate affair. Obviously, that I wouldn't say there was plenty of it before that, but that's certainly one of the bigger examples. And of course, we have opinion pages, right? The idea of editorials really started in earnest in the newspaper industry and actually spilled over into the magazine industry as well. In the digital age, obviously, both the industry is losing both papers and readers. I would say cratering would be an accurate term because so many are now going to the digital realm or have gone. Many surviving papers are called ghost newspapers, devoid of much actual local news and often carrying only syndicated content from other newspapers. That's because the ones that are hanging on, in many cases, have consolidated with and are part of bigger, corporate entities that basically share resources. And so a lot of the idea of local coverage is kind of disappearing with these quote unquote ghost newspapers. We also have something called news deserts, right? Communities without a regular, reliable news source. A couple of examples, by the way: Atlanta, Georgia. As of January 1st, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ended a 157-year print run to become a digital-only publication, making Atlanta the largest U.S. metro area without a daily printed newspaper. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Post-Gazette announced it's publishing its final edition and ceasing all operations shortly after you probably watch this, which is scheduled to be May 3rd of this year. And it's ceasing all operations, including digital, due to insurmountable financial losses, leaving Pittsburgh without a legacy daily newspaper. That's crazy. Richmond, California, has not had its own local daily newspaper for several years. And I can tell you long ago, I obviously cut my teeth journalistically in Colorado. There was two papers that were there that were major. One was the Rocky Mountain News, the other one, the Denver Post. And the Rocky Mountain News went out of business as far back as 2009, if you can believe that. So in any event, and LA has had, a shift, right? The Herald Examiner was here for a long time. It's no longer here. The LA Times in a world of hurt. The future for U.S. newspapers and magazines lies in their value as digital brands, certainly not, in the printed version. Here are your top newspapers by circulation, and this is recent numbers. The Wall Street Journal is number one at 550,000 daily. But I want to show you something. Look at the USA Today, for example. That's the fifth. That's in the top five. 103,000. 20 years ago, the USA Today had a 2.3 million circulation. This is printed versions, right? The LA Times, by the way, 6 with 80,000. The LA Times used to normally easily pull over 1 million. And again, no one's buying the paper version of these things, so it's a very stark reflection on the industry. But look at top news websites. This is as of February 2026 monthly visits. And the New York Times, for example, which on the previous slide had shown you there was 250,000, daily circulation. New York Times just in the month of February alone had 433.6 million people visit. 433.6 million. So you can tell that there's a significant amount of people that are still hunting for information, but it's all in the digital universe. So take a look at those numbers. I don't need to parrot them all. This is something that I find a little concerning, though, because of the fact that now we're getting all of our information online and through social media, through doom scrolling, etc. How much are we actually absorbing? So when I was much younger, one of the things I looked forward to most is that I would always go out to the front porch, get the newspaper. I would always carve out 10, 15, 20 minutes before school every day and just like look. And maybe it's just because I'm a journalism geek, but I would look at the LA Times, I look at the sports section, news, local edition. Sometimes I even look at it when I got home. So I felt like I had a pretty good sense of, at least just that particular paper. I was reading a lot of the articles from start to finish. Look at the average minutes per visit for the top 50 U.S. newspapers by circulation. Now, again, a little older graphic, but I think it's still pertinent. As of 2020, which was not all that long ago, we were spending literally 2 minutes per visit. How much can you get in 2 minutes, right? I don't think a lot. So it speaks to the fact that what we're doing is we're a headline-driven society, right? We're getting our information basically by, hey, let's scroll, and we see a headline, and then we think, okay, that's cool, that's the story, we move on. One thing I want you guys to kind of like maybe take away from this class, from this lecture, is that try to click through to the article and read it, because sometimes what the headline is telling you and what the article are saying are two different things. The headline can be just clickbait, but if you start to read the article, you start to see things in the article that maybe are completely different in terms of what the story is actually about. So in any event, my preaching done. Let's talk about the inverted pyramid, okay? I hinted at this, I think, in part 2, but basically newspapers in general, articles that you see online, very much written for the most part in what's called the inverted pyramid style. It's a, story form for packaging and presenting objective reporting. It answers the who, what, why, where, when at the top, less significant details at the bottom. Let me just kind of show you a graphical representation and tell you why this is important. So that is the inverted pyramid. That is the lead. So when you guys read a story, if you can answer basically the 5 W's and the H, or 90% of that, that is an inverted pyramid lead. It's a summary lead, right? And the reason it's done that way is for two main reasons. One, it has to do with the telegram and the Telegraph. So basically, when the Telegraph was really kind of in its heyday, back in the mid part of the 19th century, and honestly, for most of the, up until we got to radio, war was very interesting. So the Civil War, for example, you had correspondents that were trying to basically report during the war. Actually, it was a lot of different things, but in particular, when it came to news, there was a lot of war reporting going on during the Civil War. And so if, I was trying to file a story about a battle or a certain situation, and I would have the guy at Western Union type out my message and send it down the telegraph line, and then someone else would translate at the other end. There was a constant desire for soldiers from the North and the South to be cutting telegraph wires. Why? To disrupt the flow of communication. They were doing it not just to obviously disrupt some, war story going by, but probably even doing it more so to try to disrupt just generally coordinating of communication between, for troop movements. But the fact is that they were cutting those wires. And so they basically came up with, the reporters did, they came up with the notion of really kind of jamming all the facts up at the top so that even if 10% or 20% of the, the story had gone through, that people would understand it. So if you look at newspapers prior to like you look at the very first newspapers, they're written in essay format, they're written in narrative format, they're written in a way where you'd have to read the entire article to kind of get the sense of what the whole thing was about. Now it was much more clear and concise, and it had a lot to do with that. The other reason that the inverted pyramid then became a very popular thing is that we talked about advertising and fitting articles into, into certain slots. So like if a newspaper had a certain amount of pages it could publish and it wanted to fit stories in, a lot of times it would take a story and have to cut it down. So, if I had 1,000-word story that I'd written and they could only fit 600 words in, doesn't it make sense to put kind of the summary lead at the top, and then everything after that is basically just amplifying what's in the lead? So even if I'm cutting from the bottom, for example, my audience still understands the gist of the story. So those were the two reasons why for the inverted pyramid. It works very much differently in broadcast. I won't get into it, but suffices to say, inverted pyramid very much associated with, print reporting and, journalism articles. All right, let's talk about history, guys. So one of the things that I think that you could easily study is you could study that there's journalism long before it started here in the colonies or in our history. But I really want to focus just on sort of how we got here from the early development of American newspapers versus kind of the more global aspect of it. So my apologies if you're a globalist, but in any event, so journalism in early America, there was very few papers to start with, right? Because when we get to books, we'll talk about the fact that a lot of people didn't read, but those that did, basically didn't have a lot to read at the very start. Printers and postmasters did most of the early publishing. News obviously was not as timely as it is today. This is, a full 140 years, 150 years before the invention of the telegraph, right? We talked about how slow news would travel during this era. But in 1690, so the idea of, and then of course, last thing is the idea of a free press was not endorsed by a colonial government in England. We were not a democracy yet, right? So therefore, we had to have some government permission when it came to publishing. So in 1690, Benjamin Harris published the first American newspaper, Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. One of the items in the paper alleged an affair between the King of France and his son's wife. Well, that wasn't good because being in a very Puritan area in New England, the paper was shut down after one issue, so no free press as of yet. In 1704, Boston postmaster John Campbell put out the Boston News. It was the first regularly published newspaper, if you want to call it that, but it was published with royal permission. It was dull. Many European news articles were reprinted, only had 300 subscribers. It was not profitable, so it didn't last all that long. Then the New England Courant established a tradition of running more candid and critical stories, and that was, believe it or not, run by James Franklin. And he published without government permission. That was a problem because eventually he got tossed in prison or in jail, I should say. So his brother, Benjamin Franklin, took the paper over, moved to Pennsylvania, called it the Pennsylvania Gazette. And historians consider it the highest quality of the colonial papers, and that is because it boasted such innovations as legible type headlines, a cleaner layout. Franklin later retired at age 42, but during his career started several papers, published a magazine, ran the first editorial cartoon, proved advertising copy could sell merchandise, and demonstrated journalism could be an honorable profession. All Benjamin Franklin's legacy. Pretty cool. New York Weekly Journal came along in 1733. Owner John Peter Zenger arrested for seditious libel. He was defaming a public official's character in print after stories critical of the royal governor of New York. The jury ruled in his favor. Since the stories were true, it provided the foundation for the First Amendment. So that's a very significant moment in journalism, early journalism history, if you will, for the American journalism. Obviously, as we got closer to the Revolutionary War, the development of colonial papers were shaped by social, cultural, and political responses to British rule and its eventual overthrow. In fact, many of the newspapers turned to how the country was going to be run during the Revolutionary War. Pages were filled with Federalist and anti-Federalist propaganda. There was a lot of name calling. The press was very partisan. It pushed the strategy of the particular political group that subsidized the paper. Sound familiar? Right? And there was also another type of paper during this time, commercial, which served business leaders. And so you were political, you were wealthy, you were white, and you were educated. That's who was pretty much the audience of newspapers in the latter part of the 1700s or 18th century if you're playing at home. But as we get into the 19th century, the 1800s, newspapers grew as the new country grew. And one thing I don't think the book talks about in this particular chapter, it might talk about it in book publishing, is the fact that we eventually get an education system, meaning that we start to get public education. We get universities getting established here in this country and literacy. And so all of that had a profound effect upon not just newspapers and magazines, but books and anything, in between, right? And so in any event, during the 1830s, the steam-powered printing press was invented, which made printing quicker and cheaper, 4,000 copies per hour. And we had the country becoming more literate. That was so that we first had the first statewide public school system created during the 1830s. With an increased emphasis on education, which led to a more comprehensive commitment to reading, which led to the penny press. In 1833, the penny press was born, the New York Sun being the first, and it sold for a penny. That's the penny press. The paper featured local news, which included sex, violence, and human interest stories, and no political debates. New York Morning Herald came along, obviously, as well in 1835. It was an independent paper for middle and working class readers, which included a financial page, sports page, and aggressive editorial policy that emphasized reform. And basically, 19th century growing newspaper and magazine audiences obviously had advances in technology, introduced cheap machine-made paper and mechanical presses. The telegraph allowed the rapid transmission of stories. Steam engine trains reduced distance between publication and readers. So you had just this incredible perfect storm that kind of just made newspapers just explode, right? We talked obviously about the rise of the middle class, literacy, and public education and leisure time. Lowered postal rates made magazines as inexpensive as newspapers. There's a story, by the way, that some of the early newspapers basically cost $10 per year or 6 cents an issue, which sounds like a deal, except that if you were talking about the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, that was actually comparable to a pint of whiskey, which if you go out to 7-Eleven or some other liquor store, whiskey's going to run you like 15, 20 bucks. So imagine spending that every day on a paper. Not very practical, not something the middle class nor anyone else could afford, except for those in the very elite. So anyway, penny papers began competing with 6-cent papers. They eventually raised the price to 6 cents, and they began relying on daily street sales of individual copies. And of course, there you are. You have your notable papers in that penny press era, the New York Sun, New York Herald, which were on that previous slide as well. Penny papers were innovative. They reported local news and crime. They separated news and editorial. They shifted toward advertising. It really did kind of absolutely change the industry. Um, it also redefined concept of news hiring. They actually hired people to actually go out and look for news. Reporters were assigned beats. Foreign correspondents were also popular. And of course, it was all geared towards circulation. The more papers you sold, the more you could turn around and obviously charge an advertiser. And so it really kind of cemented the fact that newspapers would become a big business. The Associated Press, founded by 6 New York newspapers in 1848, by the way, and the idea of a wire service, which is basically transmitting stories over telegraph lines, allowing publishers to print them the same day. So you had these newspapers that, pooled information, started the AP. The AP is still very much a part of things. And of course, we have Reuters is another one. Reuters and the AP are probably the big two. So if you see that on a test, that's, to answer that. Well, as we jump ahead to the basically to post-Civil War. Between the end of the war and the turn of the 19th century, the population doubled, and also not only doubling was the population, but the fact that you had a mass migration of not just people coming in from, Europe, but also people going from country to city, which would then make your circulation grow if you were a newspaper publisher, right? That you had a lot more people that you could sell papers to. And so it really gave rise to 3 absolute titans of industry that I want to go over. And the first one is E.W. Scripps. Now, E.W. Scripps, if you may have heard the name Scripps, that's because that last name, Scripps, still a very prominent country in journalism circles today. In particular, both in the journalism print industry, which is now, of course, digital, and of course the broadcast industry. I have former students right now who are former Canyons Newsies that are working for stations that are Scripps stations, to tell you how influential that company is. But who was E.W. Scripps? Well, he was born in 1854. He died in 1926. He was a pioneering American newspaper publisher. He believed that journalism should serve ordinary people. He founded a major chain of newspapers across the U.S. He started with the Cleveland Press. He had papers in Cincinnati as well, both very industrial, so that, he was all over the kind of the Northeast. He focused on fair wages, government accountability. He pushed for accessible, practical reporting. He broke from partisan traditions of early newspapers. He featured concisely edited news, human interest stories, editorial independence, and frequent crusades for the working class. And he also partnered with Roy Howard and expanded national reach and standardized news quality. In fact, he pioneered the idea of the newspaper chain. And by 1911, he owned 18 papers. So that was, that was just some of E.W. Scripps. He also helped found the Scripps Institution of Oceanography down there in San Diego, and he promoted public knowledge and education. So he was a contrarian and a reformer. And again, as I mentioned, distrusted large corporations, lived modestly despite his wealth, and advocated for editorial independence. Next in line was Joseph Pulitzer. You've heard of the Pulitzer Prize. Yes, he was the one who created it. He was born in 1847 in Hungary. So like Scripps, both were immigrants. He immigrated to the U.S., became one of America's most influential newspaper publishers. He was known for transforming journalism into a modern mass medium, and his claim to fame is a couple things. One, he purchased and revitalized the St. Louis Dispatch. Looking here at my notes to see if I've got anything crossing over. He basically later acquired the New York World, turning it into a top paper. Pulitzer encouraged plain writing and the inclusion of maps and illustrations to help immigrant and working class readers. He ran sensational stories on crime and sex, so a lot of human interest, right? And advice columns on women's pages. He crusaded for many social causes. So a lot of these guys were crusaders in some shape or form, but also manufactured events and staged stunts. So he was, very much, we'll talk about a term called yellow journalism. He was very much a part of this. And basically, he and the guy, the next guy I'm going to introduce you to, were very much about sort of sensationalizing news to sell newspapers to increase circulation, right? The consummate clickbaiters back in the 19th century. He did advocate for working class readers. He pushed for government accountability. He supported investigative reporting and exposure of corruption. But he also competed fiercely with William Randolph Hearst, who we had first kind of talked about just a smidge in film, right? With, Citizen Kane. The rivalry helped fuel sensational reporting in the 1890s. He said he later regretted this phase and promoted higher standards. His enduring legacy, funding and founding the Columbia University's journalism school. He established, as I said, the Pulitzer Prize, which is still the highest honor in journalism. He left a lasting impact on journalistic ethics and education. Last but not least, of the three titans, we have William Randolph Hearst, right? And this guy, if you know the name Hearst, the Hearst Castle up there in San Simeon, north of San Luis Obispo, north of Morro Bay, that is the one and only William Randolph Hearst. That was his abode, if you will. Born in 1863, the son of a wealthy mining family. He was actually born here on the West Coast. He was actually given control of the San Francisco Examiner at age 24. And he later grew those holdings to dozens of newspapers, magazines, and radio stations. He controlled a vast media empire at its peak. He basically was all about impact, novelty, and prominence, much like Joseph Pulitzer. He popularized sensationalistic storytelling and bold headlines. He advanced investigative reporting and large-scale exposés. He used media power to shape public opinion. So he would have done swimmingly in this day and age. He later bought and owned the New York Journal, where he focused on lurid, sensational stories, and he appealed to immigrant readers by using large headlines and bold layout. He invented interviews, faked pictures, encouraged conflicts, got us involved to the Spanish-American War in 1898. He was kind of the goat of clickbaiting and just over-the-top yellow journalistic type of news, right? He was in a fierce competition with Joseph Pulitzer in the 1890s. And of course, his papers were accused of sensationalism and exaggeration, which is synonymous with yellow journalism. And again, critics argued his coverage influenced political events, including the Spanish-American War. Believe it or not, he had a political career beyond just his publishing. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives. He used his newspapers to support political goals, so he understood the power of media. He ran unsuccessfully to be governor here in California and the mayor of New York City. And he built one of the most influential media empires in history. And as you learn from chapter 7 film, he inspired Citizen Kane, which was made in 1941, even trying to get that movie not put in theaters. He ultimately failed. He left a complex legacy of innovation and controversy in journalism. And if you ever want to study a fascinating character, I would recommend spending some more time learning about William Randolph Hearst. And of course, I've never been to I've been by his castle up north. I've never been in it, but from what I understand from friends that have gone, they say it's opulence times 10. All right. Journalism from the late 1800s to World War II. So reporting changes in the late 19th century as a result of both Pulitzer and Hearst and their stain, I guess, on the industry and successes, I guess, too. But there is more of a story-driven model and just the facts objective model. So rather than just, pushing the news and trying to shove it down people's throats and sensationalize it to create kind of a narrative thread, you have Adolph Oakes come along, and he takes over the New York Times in the late 1890s. The New York Times, by the way, and both the LA Times both came along in the 1850s. But he championed a purely informational news model. He focused on documenting major events and issues. He targeted affluent and educated readers. So he kind of started to get away from sort of the common man, if you will. but he did lower his price to a penny in 1898 to attract middle-class readers. So he hadn't forgotten it. He tried to make it, I think he tried to do a lot of it. And he rejected the notion of yellow journalism. After World War I, we have the sense that objective style reporting was insufficient for explaining complex national and global conditions. Papers began to revisit the analytical function of news, leading to the rise of interpretive journalism. So this notion that rather than be objective and sort of straightforward, time to start pushing the envelope again. And in interpretive journalism, it aims to explain key issues or events that place them in a broader context. A gentleman named Walter Lippmann came along during this time. He was a preeminent 20th century American journalist, author, and political commentator, often considered the father of modern journalism. He is vital for coining the term stereotype, popularizing Cold War, and arguing that media distorts reality, shaping how public opinion forms in democratic systems. He was a syndicated columnist. I'm sorry, wait a minute. Here is why he matters. In his landmark 1922 book, Public Opinion, Lippmann argued that citizens cannot make informed decisions because they see the world through distorted, simplified stereotypes. He believed the media reports pseudo-realities rather than facts, which hinders effective self-governance. So the idea of narrative, right? That everything that we do, see, read is all being presented kind of in good and evil narrative style. It may not necessarily be the truth, but it is what is presented as the truth, which is kind of scary, right? Which is certainly what's happening today. His intellectual contributions throughout his career, he shifted from a socialist to a conservative, writing extensively on the challenges of liberty and responsible leadership in modern society. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So interesting that he also had 3. He said he came up with 3 press responsibilities: make a record, provide analysis, outline a plan. So very much dictated how news would be covered, for decades, thanks to some of his ideas. As for readership, well, it declined. It began during the Great Depression with the rise of radio. So radio coming along certainly took over if newspapers were kind of the sort of the big dog on the block in terms of news. As soon as radio came along and radio news came along, it certainly peeled off some of that audience. Of course, during the Great Depression, there was a massive consolidation of the newspaper industry. Again, we've talked about the Great Depression. 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of work, and here's a number for you. During the Great Depression, total daily newspaper circulation, although it did increase, but the general income of newspapers dropped about 20%, and about 66 daily newspapers went under during the Great Depression. Again, readership drops in the 60s and 70s. That's because of the advent of broadcast news. We first started seeing broadcast news hit kind of the airwaves in the early 1960s with the Vietnam War, and then later the men walking on the moon became very big deal when it came to kind of the era of broadcast news. Kind of almost feel like we're coming full circle with the Artemis up there in space. But one of the main people in that era in the 1960s that really became kind of a household name in everyone's living room was Walter Cronkite. And he is also our bonus word, Walter Cronkite. So if you hear that word, write that in, because that's definitely part of your quiz. Other nations, again, readership dropped in the 2000s as online readership increased. Again, we're talking about newspapers, right? Paper versions, because everyone started going into the digital realm. So it's just been a series of, circulation drain, if you will. Radio, television news, online, all of it has combined to really make print newspapers really kind of struggle or almost go out of business, right? And other nations, though, have experienced increases in readership. I noticed that when I went to Europe, by the way. Now, maybe that's not the case now in 26, but certainly 5 or 6 years ago when I was there, I noticed how many newspapers were actually a part of European newsstands and airports and whatnot. And here's an interesting number. El Grafico, I think that's the name of this. It's a Mexican newspaper. 1.27 million circulation. El Grafico. So there you go. Anyway, don't know if that's still the case, but that was what I had as of 6 months ago. Anyway, USA Today. Okay, why do I highlight the USA Today? Well, because in the 1980s, new style and design helped newspapers compete in a television-dominated world. So as they were starting to bleed readership and circulation because of television, the USA Today was the first newspaper to acknowledge television's central role in mass culture. Used TV-inspired color and designed its vending boxes to look like boxy colored TVs. It mimicked TV news with a writing style. In fact, if you look at USA Today, written very, very simple, third grade education, to say, at best. So just about anybody can read it. Of course, online journalism redefines news, which, we'll talk a little bit more here in a second, but basically replaced the morning newspaper, sped up the news cycle. Non-traditional sources shape stories, citizen journalism, if you will. We'll get back to that in a minute. But in 1980, the Columbus Dispatch became the first newspaper to go online. Digital content has completely changed the newspaper and magazine industry in key ways. Rather than subscribing to traditional print publications, most readers now begin their day on their smartphones, right? You do it, I do it. Our tablets, our computers, we're not picking up that paper. We're really literally just on our phones, seeing what's going on here. In any event, digital content has sped up publication cycle to a constant stream of information. We're now 24/7. Again, can you imagine a world where when I was going to college in 1984 and 85 at the University of Colorado, and I was a big Colorado football fan, and they started finally playing better football my sophomore year, and I was really excited to see if they'd make the quote unquote top 25. I would literally sit there in my hallway. This is what a geek I was. At 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, you'd see the guy walk through and start delivering newspapers at everyone's door at 3 in the morning. Imagine that, because right now, the minute something ends, whether it be news, sports, or whatever, we can instantly have access to it. That's not what was happening 40 years ago. Newspapers have taken advantage of the internet's flexibility, unlimited space, immediate updates, right? So even the LA Times, for example, or any other major newspaper website is going to give you up to the second information, just like a broadcast site could. Links to related material. We can click on anything we like within an article, hyperlinks, right? Multimedia capabilities. I cannot stress to you enough that when people come through my journalism program, you've got to learn it all. You've got to be comfortable with talking conversational, with talking broadcast style, with talking inverted pyramid, with being able to be comfortable with picking up a camera, being comfortable to edit. It all is in one person now. And so multimedia is huge. And that's, again, what goes back to backpack journalism. Unfortunately, when it comes to newspapers, one of the things that they're running up against is something called a paywall. I'm sure you've come across this, and if you've ever had to research anything, go to the LA Times. You can't get through it has a paywall now. New York Times, paywall, or maybe you get to a certain site that says, hey, you get 3 free articles this month, and then you have to pay for it. I understand why they do that. You can't stay in business for free, but paywalls are certainly a big part of the ecosystem now. And now you're seeing paywalls, of course, with streaming media too. Netflix, you have to pay a certain amount more money to have more people share your plan, if you will. Anyway, citizen journalism. I promised I'd talk about this a bit. We had already kind of hinted at it earlier in this lecture. The combination of the online news surge and traditional newsroom cutbacks has led to citizen journalism, which is that activists, amateurs, and concerned citizens, not professional journalists, use the internet and social media to disseminate news and information, right? The idea that someone could literally be the person that shoots Rodney King, right? The video of Rodney King, well, suddenly they become a journalist, right? The industry relies on people to be citizen journalists. We rely on people who in often cases are doing their own blogs or tweeting their own stories out on X or Twitter. Not classically trained, maybe not 100% accurate, but that's who we're relying on. So we need to be careful, right? Many news organizations are trying to corral citizen journalists to make up for journalists lost to downsizing. So in my newsroom, for example, we don't have that many people on a weekend or even during the week, for that matter, as much as we used to. So we have an assignment desk that is constantly trolling social media to see that what people are posting, and then if they see something that might be newsworthy, reaching out to those people and actually asking for permission to use their information and their photos and their videos. So citizen journalism really becoming kind of just, as much as there are some old schoolers who are like, I don't know, we absolutely 100% are using across the board, journalism and journalism organizations are using citizen journalists. All right, journalism is a vital yet dangerous profession. You can see the number of journalists killed worldwide from 1995 to 2023. There were obviously a lot of deaths within the most recent Israel-Hamas war. There's been no shortage of journalists that put themselves in violent situations, and it can be a dangerous profession. Journalists, for example, in Mexico trying to cover the Mexican drug cartels, very difficult to do so because they often become victims. They become victims of they often get murdered or intimidated, strongly intimidated. And so very much journalism is a vital yet dangerous profession. Obviously, if you're in entertainment or sports, not so much, but if you're doing news, hard news, you're doing war corresponding, you're putting yourself in harm's way in natural disaster areas, yes, it can get sketchy. And finally, newspapers and democracy. Newsroom cutbacks are threatening many reporters. Of course, we've documented that with the fact that if you have newspapers going out of business, where the reporters are losing their jobs, they're having to land elsewhere. And as the digital culture continues to grow, what will become of newspapers? Will we actually have a printed version of a newspaper 10 years from now? Tough to tell. Anyway, well, I presented a lot of information in these three parts of this chapter on journalism. Hopefully you've taken something from it. Again, you're going to be quizzed on all of this, not just as part of this module, but later as part of your final. So if you didn't pick up on the bonus words for each of the first three, they're in there. Go search them out. I would encourage you to listen. My assumption is all the links that I clicked on will play as part of this lecture on YouTube. If they don't, make sure that you see them separately. I'll make sure I post those in case that happens. But the next time I see you, we will be talking books.